Hi, I'm Lucy Lagunienta, a research assistant for the Book of Mormon Art Catalog, and today I'm here with Dr. Kenneth Hartvigsson. Dr. Hartvigsson holds a doctorate in art history from Boston University, and he was the previous curator of American art at the BYU Museum of Art. He currently teaches full-time as part of the art history faculty here at BYU. The piece we'll be talking about today here is A Bright Recollection by Paige Anderson. The work is acrylic and oil on panel, and we're pairing it today with Alma chapters 8 through 12. So as we look at this piece, I just want to start off with its style for a little bit. Abstract art can be a little bit uncomfortable when it's not something we're used to and familiar with, and a little bit intimidating sometimes. So from previous conversations with you, I know that for you, art doesn't necessarily have to make logical sense.
Right.
So give us some background on how you see abstract art.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that art, for me personally, communicates with me very much in the same way that the Spirit communicates with me, which is to say that sometimes I have spiritual experiences, and I'd imagine a lot of people have had similar experiences in their lives, where you have spiritual experiences where you feel something or come to know something that is very important to you, very significant to you, but that you might struggle to put into language that would be understandable by others. The Spirit tends to operate in a way that I wouldn't say is illogical or anti-logical, but seems to be sometimes outside of just the realm of our logical experience of the world. And art can be very similar to me, that I can interact with artworks and art objects and sometimes feel things or think things or come to understand things that then it would be difficult to turn to someone and explain exactly how that process had taken place. And you're right, particularly when we talk about abstract art, it can be intimidating or isolating for people to look at an abstract work of art, especially if it's something that they don't spend a lot of time doing, if they don't have a lot of experience looking at abstract art. If a work is truly abstract, something like this, where it lacks recognizable features or figures, no conventional narrative, you can feel a little untethered. You're kind of set on your own, and you're left without recognizable kind of mileposts to judge your experience by. But for me personally, I actually think that's one of the things that makes abstract art very valuable, which is to say that abstract art gives us a space and a time where we can actually just think and feel whatever it is that we think and feel. Standing in front of an abstract work of art, you don't have to understand a narrative. You don't necessarily have to think about meaning. You certainly can engage with those things if you'd like to, but more than anything else, an abstract work of art just gives you a time and place and says, what are you feeling? Anything you want to feel is okay in this space. And so I find it very liberating personally.
Fantastic. That's excellent background for this. Thank you. How do you see this piece interpreting or engaging with the scriptures that we have in Alma, chapters 8 through 12?
Looking at Alma 8 through 12, one of the words that came to my mind is persistence. When we see this story of Alma, preaching the word and being rejected, and but then having this angel come back to him and say, you have to go back. You have to do it again. Even though nobody listened to you, even though they threatened you, even though they kicked you out, you need to go back. You need to do this again. And that feeling that I think a lot of us would recognize in our lives, of sometimes being asked to do things over and over that have seemed to be unsuccessful or have been difficult or have been challenging, and sometimes it's easier for us to say to ourselves or say to the Lord, we already tried that and it didn't work. Are you sure I need to do that again? Right? Like I'm ready for the next thing, right? I'm ready for that prayer to be answered, or I'm ready for that way to be opened, or for that relationship to be healed, whatever the case may be. But there is a way that the Lord teaches us through asking us to try again, and do the same process again, sometimes even when it's challenging. And, I look at a piece like this where we see these small shapes that are repeated over and over, and it is actually through their repetition that we can stand back and see a really wonderful and beautiful pattern, and that pattern takes a shape that is above and beyond what the individual forms that are being repeated are.
Sort of a greater whole.
A greater whole, exactly. And so we think about Alma and Amulek being asked to go back and preach to people who have already said no. And I think we can, again, step back and say, well, there is a greater pattern at play here. There's a larger picture. There's a greater whole involved, but that greater whole only takes place because there are people willing to do the work again and again with that persistence. Yeah. And so that's something I really see. Another thing that I think about with these chapters is the idea of interactions between peoples. We see Alma at first on his own, and then meeting Amulek, right? And so we see the two of them learning to work together, and we see Amulek's conversion and commitment to the gospel. So we see the two of them kind of coming together and becoming a missionary companionship, and we see the interactions between them and the audiences that they're preaching to, both people in these audiences who continue to reject them, and then also a few people who are convinced or are touched by the words that they share. And so it is very much a story of those interactions between individuals. And once again, I think that's something we see here, right? We see this interaction, this interplay between these little discrete pieces, these individual shapes, which if you took them out, may seem identical in some ways or may seem very different in some ways. Whether you're talking about their shape, they may seem identical, or the colors, they may seem completely opposed to each other. But it is, once again, that idea of combining these things together, the interactions between these things, which gives this piece its power and its shape. And so I think, for me, this piece very much speaks about small things building together and the way that we can interact together to create something.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I love that idea of persistence, especially the artist talks about in her process of creation, how she'll paint and then she'll sand down a layer and she'll real paint. So that totally ties in with this repetitive process to create something bigger and greater.
Absolutely.
That's perfect. All right, can you contextualize this piece within like the greater genre of LDS art for us? Yeah,
Latter-day Saint art has traditionally been a little wary of abstraction.
Certainly.
I think it's taken a long time for Latter-day Saint artists to embrace abstraction as a viable way of expressing faith. Mm-hmm. And even now, even though we do see some artists doing this, it's still not the norm. It's still a little bit of an outlier. We do certainly have other Latter-day Saint artists who are incorporating a freer use of color and a freer use of form in their paintings or in their sculptures or drawings, etc. But still, it's much more common in Latter-day Saint art to have a strong narrative base and a strong narrative content that is still very much the norm, relying upon human figures and these kinds of things. And so this is, I think, an unusual example of Latter-day Saint art, but I think it's a hopeful example. Works like this help me see that we are experiencing a kind of Latter-day Saint renaissance in the arts. I think this is a time of an opening of style, an opening of opportunities, where members of the church are recognizing that faith can be expressed in lots of different ways. Yeah. Faith can be expressed through different life experiences and cultural experiences, cultural backgrounds, and the history of modern art, which is something I teach at BYU. The history of modern art is oftentimes discussed as a kind of secularization, or that there's a strong secularization that takes place during the modernist movement in the 19th and 20th centuries, where a lot of people talk about artists challenging tradition and challenging faith and challenging organized religion. And that is certainly something that happens within the tradition of modern art. But also within the kind of the writing of modern art history, the historiography of modern art. Recently, a lot of people are saying, well, faith didn't completely disappear. A lot of modern artists that we talk about never completely left their faith, or perhaps left organized religion for a while, but then returned to it. And so even though traditionally things like abstraction and the experimentation that we see in form and color and these kinds of things has been paired with a more kind of a-religious or secular environment. I think we're now starting to realize that that's a partial truth. And so I think there always was room in the world of abstract art, the world of modernism and postmodern art. I think there always was room for faith in that conversation. So I think there's an opportunity to see works like this not only as broadening the Latter-day Saint art experience, but also as reclaiming a position in the world of modern art and contemporary art that says you can express personal faith. You don't have to leave those things behind to still be finding new ways of creating and expressing yourself artistically.
I love that so much. That's great. Finally, can you share a personal reaction you have to this piece or to the scripture block we talked about?
I really love I really love her work. From the first time I saw one of her pieces, one of the things that struck me was exactly what you mentioned before, is the sanding. The fact that, we have these beautiful colors, these layers of colors, but then she'll sand back to reveal these interweaving kind of layers and nuances of color. For me, it very much feels like something that could be interpreted by somebody as an imperfection. It's scratching, right? The sanding is literally scratching. It's wearing away the surface, and sometimes we only want the world to see the surface, right? We only want people to see what's on the outside, what we consider kind of the finished surface of who we are. And so by kind of scratching, she's revealing something that lies beneath that maybe feels like sometimes the things we want to hide, or the things we feel like we've outgrown, or that are no longer part of us. But that's the beauty of these pieces, is that by sanding, by scratching, by revealing these layers of color, this nuance of color, it makes it a far richer composition. Yeah. The colors are more complex. They're more dynamic. And it creates actually a kind of, we keep talking about like a whole, right? It creates a kind of holistic feeling, because you'll see these scratches almost as a unifying thing between the different shapes. And I find that to be such a beautiful commentary on who we are. The fact that what we tend to view as our imperfections might actually be the things that are making us richer people and are providing the nuance through which we learn and grow, and that sometimes we can't see that what we view as our imperfections are actually things that make us really glorious and beautiful. And one of the things it talks about in the scripture, and even the title of this piece is the bright recollection, right? Yeah. Well, in the context of the verse in the Book of Mormon, it's a bright recollection of our weaknesses, a bright recollection of our guilt. And but that phrase is so interesting, a bright recollection, which sounds so positive, and then of our guilt, which sounds pretty heavy, right? But so I think that kind of balancing of the light and shadow, the bright and the dark, the things that we think are unfinished or imperfect, and the overall pattern that is actually the larger perfection, the larger beauty that we should be moving toward. I feel like all of those things are presented by this painting.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And thanks for joining us on this episode of Behold.